Ask most people when central banking began, and you'll get a handful of predictable answers. Some will say the Federal Reserve, founded in 1913 to fix a broken American banking system. Others, if they took an economics class that actually covered the topic, will point to the Bank of England, chartered in 1694. A rare few will reach further back and mention Sweden's Riksbank, established in 1668. None of these answers are factually wrong, and yet all of them miss something essential, because they all assume central banking is fundamentally a modern invention, a product of parliaments and charters and printed banknotes. That assumption is the first thing historians get wrong. The real story doesn't start with a legislature. It starts thousands of years earlier, in a place with no printing press, no stock exchange, and no concept of a nation-state at all. It starts in a temple. The textbook version of this history is comforting in its simplicity. Governments, so the story goes, eventually realized they needed an institution to manage the money supply, smooth out financial panics, and keep commerce running, so they built one. It's an orderly narrative, the kind that fits neatly into a paragraph of a high school textbook. It is also almost entirely wrong. Central banking did not emerge from foresight. It emerged from emergencies, from wars nobody could afford, from currencies that had been quietly hollowed out until they were worth a fraction of their face value, and from private lenders who saw in every crisis a chance to convert desperation into leverage. The men who built the first proto-central banks weren't reformers acting in the public interest. They were creditors, and creditors have never lent money for free. Understanding that distinction changes everything about how you should read the rest of this history. To find the true starting point, you have to travel back roughly 4,000 years to the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia in the territory of modern-day Iraq. Long before coins existed, long before anything resembling a government treasury existed, the temples of Sumer and Babylon were already functioning as financial institutions. Priests accepted deposits of barley, silver, and livestock from farmers and merchants, and in return they issued records of ownership, inscribed onto clay tablets that tracked who had deposited what, who owed what, and at what rate of interest. The Code of Hammurabi, dated to roughly 1750 BCE, devotes entire sections to regulating these transactions, capping interest rates, specifying penalties for default, and setting rules for the safekeeping of deposited grain. This was not casual bartering between neighbors. This was codified finance, administered by an institution whose authority rested not on armies, but on shared religious belief. Here is where most accounts of financial history stumble. They treat the temple economy of Mesopotamia as an interesting footnote, a primitive precursor with no real connection to the sophisticated banking systems of today. But look closer at what these temples actually did. They served as a trusted place to store wealth. They created a standardized unit of account that let people trade grain for silver and silver for livestock without haggling over relative value every time. They extended credit, lending out more in promises than they physically held in reserve at any given moment. And their entire system rested on a kind of collective faith, the belief that the temple's word was as good as the goods themselves. Strip away the 4,000 years, and you're looking at the skeleton of every central bank that would ever follow. The priests of Babylon understood something that modern economists still spend entire careers trying to articulate. Money isn't a substance, it's a form of trust. A clay tablet was valuable only because people believed the temple would honor it. A modern banknote is valuable for exactly the same reason, just with better printing. Move the clock forward roughly 2,000 years and the scene shifts to Rome, where finance became not just organized, but industrialized. In the Roman Forum, professional money changers called argentari worked from wooden benches. The Latin word for bench, bancus, is the direct ancestor of our word bank. These argentari took deposits, exchanged currencies, transferred funds between clients in different cities, and extended loans against collateral. In every functional sense, they were bankers, centuries before the word existed in its modern form. But Rome also revealed the darker cousin of banking, the temptation of the state to manipulate its own currency. As imperial military spending outpaced tax revenue, emperors began shaving down the silver content of the denarius. A coin that had once been almost pure silver was diluted, generation after generation, until by the middle of the 3rd century, it was little more than a bronze disc with a thin silver wash. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, repeated policy, an invisible tax extracted from anyone who held Roman currency, disguised as ordinary coinage. Prices spiraled, trust in the currency collapsed, and the monetary chaos that followed became one of the many pressures that helped pull the empire apart. This pattern, a government secretly debasing its own money to fund ambitions it can't otherwise afford, would repeat itself in nearly every century that followed. And it is precisely this recurring pattern that eventually made some kind of centralized monetary authority feel not just useful, but unavoidable. Once a state starts manipulating its own money, someone eventually has to manage the fallout. The only question history keeps asking, again and again, is whose interests that manager actually serves. Jump ahead more than 1,000 years, past the long financial silence of the early medieval period, and you land in Florence in the final years of the 14th century. This is where modern banking, in a form we would actually recognize, begins to take shape. In 1397, Giovanni de' Medici founded a bank that would grow into the most powerful financial institution in Europe. The Medici Bank did not invent double-entry bookkeeping, but it popularized the practice so thoroughly that it became the standard, giving merchants and bankers alike a reliable way to track the true state of complex, sprawling finances. The Medici also refined the letter of credit, allowing a merchant to travel from Florence to London without physically carrying a fortune in coin, and they dealt heavily in bills of exchange, paper instruments that functioned, in effect, as an early and privately issued form of currency. But their most consequential innovation wasn't a financial product at all. It was structural. The Medici organized their bank as a network of legally distinct partnerships, each operating semi-independently in cities like Rome, Venice, Bruges, and London, all answering to a central holding entity in Florence. It was, in effect, the first multinational financial corporation, and it proved a principle that would echo through every later chapter of this story. Financial power, structured properly, it can move faster and reach further than any single government. The Medici also demonstrated just how completely money and political power could fuse. Their banking fortune bought them control of Florence itself, produced 4 popes, and married 2 of their daughters into the French royal family. Control the flow of capital, and you can eventually control almost everything capital touches. But the Medici Bank, for all its power, remained a private family enterprise. It answered to the family ledger, not to any state. The next leap, towards something that looked like a public monetary institution, would require a different kind of pressure, and it would happen somewhere colder and far less glamorous than Florence. By the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic had become one of the most commercially dynamic societies on Earth, powered in large part by the Dutch East India Company, the world's first major joint stock corporation. But this explosive commercial growth exposed a serious structural flaw. The Dutch provinces were minting coins independently, with wildly inconsistent silver and gold content, while foreign coins of every denomination poured into Amsterdam's markets from across the continent. Nobody could be entirely sure what any given coin was actually worth, and counterfeiting thrived in the confusion. Trade itself was grinding against the friction of monetary chaos. In response, the city of Amsterdam did something quietly revolutionary in 1609. It established the Amsterdam Wissel Bank, housed in the basement of the city's town hall. Merchants could deposit coins of any origin and receive credit in a standardized unit called bank money, a form of currency that existed only as an entry in a ledger, with no physical form at all. Because the city itself guaranteed the integrity of those ledger entries, bank money quickly became more trusted than the actual metal coins circulating outside its walls. It even traded at a premium. People began to prefer the abstraction to the object. This moment deserves far more attention than it typically gets in popular history, because what the Wissel Bank achieved was nothing less than separating the idea of money from its physical substance. A guilder held at the bank no longer needed to correspond to a specific coin with a specific weight of silver. It became a pure accounting entry, backed not by metal but by institutional guarantee. This is the conceptual bedrock beneath every modern currency in existence. Every dollar, every euro, every yen today is, at its core, a descendant of that Amsterdam ledger entry. Money as an institutional promise, rather than a physical commodity. Some historians insist the Wissel Bank wasn't a true central bank, since it never set interest rates, never acted as a lender of last resort, and never regulated other banks. Narrowly, that's correct. But the objection misses the larger point. The Wissel Bank built the architecture of trust on which every later central bank would be constructed, proving that an institution could manage money more reliably than a marketplace of clipped, shaved, and counterfeit coins ever could. There's a darker postscript to this story that rarely makes it into the popular telling. For most of its history, the Wissel Bank maintained something close to a full reserve. Every unit of bank money was, in theory, backed by an equivalent amount of precious metal sitting in its vaults. But over the decades, the city of Amsterdam quietly began borrowing from the bank to cover its own expenses, and the Dutch East India Company, increasingly strained by military and colonial costs, drew on the bank's reserves as well. By the late 1700s, the gap between what the bank claimed to hold and what it actually held had grown enormous. When the discrepancy finally came to light, confidence collapsed almost overnight. The very institution that had pioneered abstract money was ultimately undone by the oldest problem in finance. Someone had quietly been spending the reserves. It's a cautionary pattern that would recur in different costumes for centuries afterward. While Amsterdam was inventing the conceptual architecture of modern money, Sweden was running its own experiment nearby, and it deserves far more credit than it usually receives. In 1656, Johan Palmstruch founded Stockholm's Banco, the country's first bank. Palmstruch had studied the Dutch system closely, but he faced a uniquely Swedish problem. The economy ran on heavy copper coinage, so bulky that a single significant transaction might require hauling plates of metal weighing several kilograms. In 1661, his bank issued Europe's first printed banknotes. Lightweight paper promises to pay the bearer copper on demand. For a while, they worked exactly as intended. Trade accelerated, commerce lightened its load, and Palmstruch was celebrated as a visionary. Then came the familiar temptation. He began issuing far more notes than the bank actually held in copper, betting correctly for a while that not everyone would demand redemption at once. When confidence wavered and people rushed to convert paper back into metal, the bank couldn't meet the demand and it collapsed. Palmstruch was convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted to imprisonment. What happened next is the part most retellings skip over. Sweden's parliament, the Riksdag, didn't abandon the idea of a public bank after this disaster. It redesigned it. In 1668, it chartered a new institution, eventually renamed Sveriges Riksbank, and placed it under direct parliamentary control rather than royal or private authority. It remains in continuous operation today, making it the oldest central bank still functioning anywhere in the world. What's striking about its founding is how deliberately it was engineered to avoid Palmstruch's mistakes. For years, it was barred from issuing banknotes at all, and its governance was structured specifically to keep it insulated from royal interference. Sweden had grasped, earlier than almost anyone, that the power to create money is dangerous precisely because it tempts both kings and financiers in the same direction. But it was in England, not Sweden, that the template for the modern central bank was truly forged, and it was forged, once again, out of war. In 1688, William of Orange crossed from the Netherlands with an army and displaced King James II in what history calls the Glorious Revolution. William arrived with a distinctly Dutch understanding of the bond between finance and military power, the belief that whichever nation could borrow most cheaply could field the largest fleets and armies. By the 1690s, England was locked in an expensive war against Louis XIV's France, and the crown's credit was so poor that it could barely borrow at any price. Into this vacuum stepped William Paterson, a Scottish financier, with a proposal that would reshape global finance. A syndicate of private investors would lend the government $1.2 million. In exchange, they would receive a royal charter permitting them to operate as a bank, issue banknotes, and manage government debt, earning 8% annual interest plus an administrative fee. On July 27, 1694, the charter was granted and the Bank of England came into existence. This is the point where the standard story diverges sharply from what actually happened. The conventional telling casts the Bank of England as a public-spirited creation meant to stabilize the nation's finances. In its origins, it was nothing of the sort. It was a private, profit-driven corporation built for the explicit purpose of lending the crown money at interest. The subscribers who put up that initial $1.2 million weren't civic reformers. They were investors, making an extraordinarily favorable deal. A loan virtually guaranteed by tax revenue, exclusive rights to issue currency, the ability to take deposits and make loans as an ordinary commercial bank, and, most valuably of all, enduring leverage over a government that had become permanently dependent on them. This is the piece of the story that gets flattened in most textbooks. Many of history's central banks were not born as instruments of the state serving the public good. They were instruments of private capital that discovered how to make lending to governments not merely profitable, but structurally permanent. The Bank of England's model spread across the world in the following centuries, almost always for the same underlying reason. A government needed to borrow, and a syndicate of financiers offered credit in exchange for banking privileges. France, Japan, and dozens of other nations followed variations on the same pattern. But nowhere was the resulting tension more dramatic than in the United States, a country that would try again, and fail again before finally settling, reluctantly and only after a genuine crisis forced its hand, on a permanent central bank. Alexander Hamilton's first Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791 and modeled directly on the Bank of England, was allowed to lapse in 1811 after fierce opposition from Jefferson and Madison, who saw it as a tool of Eastern financial elites. The second bank, chartered in 1816, met an even more hostile end when President Andrew Jackson vetoed its recharter in 1832, denouncing it as a corrupt engine of concentrated wealth. For the next 77 years, the United States operated with no central bank at all, and the results were exactly as chaotic as you'd expect. A string of devastating financial panics in 1873, 1893, and, most consequentially, 1907. The Panic of 1907 began with the collapse of the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York and spread rapidly through a financial system with no institution designed to contain it. With no central bank to intervene, it was a single private citizen, J.P. Morgan, who effectively assumed the role personally coordinating a rescue of the banking system from his private library. deciding which institutions deserved to survive and which didn't. It worked, but it left behind an uncomfortable question that Congress could no longer avoid. What happens the next time there's a crisis and there's no Morgan available to fix it? The answer, drafted in secrecy, emerged from a private meeting in November 1910 on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, where Senator Nelson Aldrich and a small group of the country's most powerful bankers spent over a week drafting the outline of what would become the Federal Reserve System. They designed a deliberately decentralized structure, regional reserve banks rather than one central institution, precisely because they understood that a single all-powerful bank headquartered in New York would never survive the deep populist suspicion of concentrated financial power. The plan they built in secret eventually became, after years of public debate and modification, the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law in December 1913. What the standard history rarely emphasizes clearly enough is that the very people who designed the institution meant to oversee American banking were themselves the country's leading bankers. That doesn't make it a conspiracy. It makes it a deal, one that gave the government the stability it needed and gave the financial industry a permanent lender of last resort, much like the deal struck in London more than 2 centuries earlier. This is the thread that runs through the entire history of central banking, and it's the thread most conventional accounts cut before they reach the end. These institutions are almost never described honestly as products of negotiation between desperate governments and opportunistic capital. Instead, they're presented as the natural, inevitable culmination of economic progress, as if any sufficiently advanced economy simply arrives at a central bank the way it arrives at electricity or paved roads. But central banking isn't natural, and it isn't neutral. It was built piece by piece out of specific crises, specific bargains, and specific winners. The 2008 financial crisis made this painfully visible again, when trillions in emergency support flowed to the very institutions whose behavior had caused the collapse, while ordinary depositors and homeowners absorbed the consequences. It was, structurally, the same rescue J.P. Morgan performed in 1907, except this time the money wasn't Morgan's own fortune. It was money created from nothing, its ultimate cost quietly distributed across everyone else through inflation and expanded public debt. None of this means central banks are villains, or that the alternative, a world without them, is preferable. The decades before centralized monetary authority existed were not calm. They were punctuated by exactly the kind of panics central banks were eventually built to prevent. But understanding where these institutions actually came from, the temples of Babylon, the counting houses of Florence, the basement ledgers of Amsterdam, and a private rail car bound for a Georgia island, matters, because it reveals that every rule governing how money is created, who benefits from it, and who absorbs the cost when it fails, was decided by specific people, at a specific moment, for specific reasons. Those choices weren't handed down by economic necessity, they were negotiated. And negotiations, unlike natural laws, can always be renegotiated, but only by people who understand how the first deal was actually struck. If this history was useful, subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown, and check out the companion video on screen now for more on how these institutions shape the world today. The tone is confident and mildly contrarian, positioning the narrator as someone revealing what conventional history glosses over. Phrases like, "Here is where most accounts stumble," and "the standard story diverges sharply from what actually happened," recur throughout, creating a consistent insider correcting the record voice. The tone stays measured rather than tipping into conspiracy. It repeatedly qualifies its boldest claims. That doesn't make it a conspiracy, it makes it a deal, so it reads as informed skepticism rather than alarmism. This is a documentary-style YouTube explainer voiceover. Rhetorical questions punctuate key transitions. What happens the next time there's a crisis? Anaphora and repetition build rhythm. It emerged from wars nobody could afford, from currencies that had been quietly hollowed out. Each historical block follows the same formula. Introduce the era. Describe the innovation, then pivot into a "here's what's usually missed." Reveal before transitioning forward in time with an explicit signpost, move the clock forward, jump ahead more than 1,000 years. The piece closes with a direct address callback to the thesis and a standard end of video call to action. Subscribe, watch next video. The script is organized as a chronological chain of thematic blocks, each centered on one era or institution. Mesopotamian temples, Rome, the Medici in Florence, the Amsterdam Whistle Bank, Sweden's Riksbank, the Bank of England, the U.S. central banking struggle, the Federal Reserve, and a closing modern-day 2008 reflection tied back to the thesis. Paragraphs are long and continuous, mirroring spoken narration rather than formal written prose, with transitions carrying the structural weight instead of headers. Each block ends on a myth versus reality turn before handing off to the next era, giving the whole script a serialized, escalating structure that builds toward the concluding argument about power and negotiation.